The best way to access the database is to use entities, where, order by, and all of those elements that make the code writing easier. But still, there are cases when we want to actually write our own custom SQL. We want to edit the SQL itself and have it run exactly like we like it. For those cases, exists the class dynamic SQL entity. Let's go ahead and show that. I'll start by adding a folder called custom SQL, and in it I will add a new controller, call it demo custom SQL, which is, I'll use the right template, UI controller, demo custom SQL. Perfect. And let's just go ahead and add this to the menu so we'll be finished with all the wiring before we start. Demo custom SQL. And new training custom SQL, demo custom SQL. Perfect. We'll run this and we'll get our empty screen. Great. Let's save it. So if we were writing this using the normal methodology of getting data, we will go ahead and define the orders table over here. And say here from orders. This is the normal way of getting data. Now, in the case where we want to use custom SQL, we will replace this usage with a different class. We're going to define the class called dynamic SQL entity, and we'll call it dynamic SQL. And we'll initialize this entity with the connections that we want to use. In this case, shared data source Northwind, and the select statement that we want to have. So I'm going to put an @ sign here so we can format it and say select order ID, ship name, and ship city from orders. Perfect. Now, the form is going to be the new dynamic SQL entity that we have created. So if we compare this to the previous code, in a normal case, we would use an entity, a regular entity defined in the models namespace. In this case, we're using a dynamic SQL entity. And just like before we were using the orders as the form, or the entity as the form, here we're using that same entity as the form. Perfect. Let's just add a few more things for it to work. We need to define the columns that come out of the query and their types and how we use them. In this case, we have order ID, ship name, and ship city. So let's go ahead and define those. I'm going to define 3 members. The first one is going to be a number column, and I'll call it order ID. I'll give it the name order ID and the format of 6. And the next one is going to be a text column called ship name. Give it the format of 50. And ship city. Format of 50. Perfect. Now, we've defined this column and these act like local columns, but to bind them to our SQL entity, to make them in a way that the resulting columns from the statement will populate these columns, we need to say here, dynamic SQL entity, columns, add, order ID, ship name, and ship city. This way, the order in which they are defined in the columns collection should match the order in which they are defined in the query itself. Perfect. So let's build this and let's go ahead and design our screen. I'm going to grab a grid, placing it here, and I'm going to select the columns for my controller. Perfect. Yes. Let's close this, build, and run. Voila, we have the data based on that SQL query that we have created. So let's reflect the change between a normal call and this call. So normally we get the entity for the models namespace, but now we are defining a dynamic SQL entity. Just like before, we're using the entity in the from, we'll be using that entity when we set the from. When we define the entity, we define the connection, the string, the select statement, and its columns, which are defined over here. Great.